Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to Conversations in Pop Culture. I have with me Steve Tanner from Time Bomb Comics, which is located in the UK. So, how are you?
I'm good, thanks. It's nice to be here, and hello to everybody, and cheers.
Yeah, I am super excited because obviously a lot of stuff is going on in the comic world right now. And as I mentioned, you are from Time Bomb Comics. You are the owner, you are the publisher, the editor, and you write a lot of content for them. So, thank you so much for being here.
No, it's my pleasure.
Now, I think Time Bomb Comics is interesting, and some people probably who are listening know of you guys, and a lot of people don't. But this company produces a lot of different comic works, both in anthologies and in one shots, and is now a mainstay of the UK. So I'm curious how the formation of Time Bomb Comics came up. For those who don't know.
Okay, well, it started with I mean, I've been into comics for years. As you can see, I'm an old guy, so I've been around for a while, and I've been into comics since the '70s, but seriously into comics since probably the early to mid '80s. And I'd done some stuff for kind of fanzines and strip scenes back in the '80s, and a couple of pitches, and in the early '90s, I got my first few professional sales, which was great. And then real life had a as it always does, has a habit of taking over. So I ended up kind of end up going abroad and working abroad for a number of years, and I'd stopped kind of doing stuff creatively. Although I was still into comics, I still wherever I went in the world, comics always came with me. So it was always there, that passion. Um, and then I ended up back in the UK in the early 2000s, and it was in 2006 I went to a Comic Con not too far from where I lived, and it was the first time I'd been to a Comic Con for, it must have been a good 10, 15 years. I used to attend them all the time in the '80s and the early '90s. And back then it was just one convention a year, and that was it in the UK. And then I saw then there was a con taking place again. So I decided to go along, and because I thought it'd be fun to kind of just do a con again after so many years. And I went there, and it was a great day out. I really enjoyed it. But the thing that really blew me away was all the indie stuff that was there. Now, and the reason why it blew me away, because when I used to see indie stuff before at the cons I used to go to, there was always indie comics there, but there was very clearly indie. I mean, you could, if you put an indie comic in the 1980s and the 1990s in the UK next to a comic that was published by one of the big mainstream guys, you could tell the difference just in terms of just the production values alone. But suddenly there was all these indie comics, and they just looked fabulous. They were really nicely printed. They had great art. They had, they just looked terrific. So I ended up coming away from that con with a big stack of indie books, of stuff I'd never seen, but I got really excited about. But more importantly, I came away and with a thought in my head that the following year I was going to come back to that con, but this time I was going to be behind the table and I would have my own book. And that's what I did. So basically, it was the inspiration of going to a convention and seeing all these great indie books being produced and thinking, actually, yeah, I want to get back into this. I want to have a part of this. So I spent that next year doing that first book and putting it together. So I did my first convention then as Time Bomb Comics in September 2007, and I've never stopped since.
And let's talk a little bit about this because clearly the comic world has changed from the 1980s, where it used to be very much a Comic Con scene, used to be very much comics, and it used to be sort of mainstream, and you get to connect with the artists. And now that's expanded massively. And one of the things in the comic realm that has expanded is this indie realm. And so, what is that like, having lived through those generations and seeing it change that way? Because you are an older guy.
I mean, that's been a great thing to see and a great thing to be a part of, because when I was going to cons in the '80s and the early '90s, it was very much a boys' club. I'll be perfectly honest. You'd see very few kind of female creators around. It's very unusual. And I think what's been great is that rise of comic creators from all different backgrounds and all different diversities and ethnicities. So that's been great to see. So that's something which I've seen since I started Time Bomb, and of course in the UK as well as the rise of this explosion of talent from all walks of life, from all kind of types of creator. What's been interesting for me is to actually see how the con scene, certainly in the UK, has exploded. And by that, I mean, the UK compared to the United States is a tiny country. Most of your states are larger than us as a country, and we used to have, we had one show a year and that was it. Now across the UK, well, obviously until this year, because things have changed slightly in the current world, but until this year came along, there were, over the last 2 or 3 years, there was 150, 200 shows taking place across the UK, which is the equivalent of 200 shows being taking place across New York State in 1 year. And now I don't know if that many shows take place in New York State, but it's just that explosion of cons. Now, within that, there is the traditional Comic Con, which is still very much comics are at the forefront. And there's a good 20, 30 of those events throughout the year. But then you have all the more kind of pop culture events, the kind of the genre specific events, but are all tied in to kind of fantasy, science fiction, horror, all that kind of stuff. There's stuff going on all the time, and that's kind of happened over the past 10, 15 years, and to actually see that explosion and to see that that's upswell of events happening, that's just been breathtaking, really. So now we've been in a position where we've gone from famine to feast, and sometimes it feels like there's almost too much going on because you just can't keep up with it. But at the same time, I'd rather eat well than starve,
I agree on that point. And I want to touch upon something because obviously the UK scene has exploded. I think the scene across the world has exploded in many ways. Because I think 15 years ago in America, we did not have the same cons that we have now. And so I'm curious because Time Bomb has been around for 13 years. What was the comic scene like prior to 2007 before you started Time Bomb? Because now Time Bomb, for those who don't know, is very much a UK mainstay.
Well, it was there, and I think it started from a few years previously, where suddenly there was that kind of shift in, I guess, ability for people to get stuff printed well, because I think that the divider was always, if you could get stuff professionally done, which is incredibly expensive, or do it yourself. And I think where things changed was when digital printing became a viable and affordable option. So suddenly, from that point on, and that would have been in the early 2000s, suddenly you could actually produce something which could stand up against anything else that was mass produced. And you could back it up with the creativity inside. And I think that was really the turning point. And what was interesting when I came in 2007, those first few conventions, that there was a few people and a few companies that were there, and they were very much of the time of the 90s. They were still doing that almost kind of that photocopied, hand-stitched kind of approach to comics, which is, there's nothing wrong with that. But what they were finding is when they were going to the conventions, there was less and less interest in what they were producing, because suddenly it seemed quite quaint compared to some of the other stuff that was coming along. So I think there was this bar that suddenly kind of was started to kind of raise, and it was all happened at the time of things like when social media came in, when digital printing came in. That was the difference. Comics were always there, and there used to be just one show a year in the early 2000s, which took place in Bristol. And what would happen was everyone in the UK that was creating comics would create something for that show, because that was the only real avenue to sell your book. apart from maybe if you had a friendly local comic shop. So you'd go to one of the Bristol show, and there would be just dozens and dozens and dozens of new titles. But that's it. After that, you wouldn't see anything new until the following year. So where things changed as well, as more cons started arriving, people then could then have more kind of structure in things like their release schedules. And suddenly you could do maybe a 4-issue or 5-issue series and release it over the course of a year, which suddenly seemed a viable and possible thing to do, as opposed to try and release it over a period of 5 or 6 years, because you only had one event to actually promote it and reach your audience. So that was the thing really where things changed. And and at the time as well, I think it was also the influences from outside. I think one of the most amazing turnarounds in comics really, and how they first kind of debuted and where they are now, is Image. I mean, if you remember the stuff that Image first produced when they first launched, when it was the Gang of Five. Let's be honest, it was awful stuff. It was dreadful. It was this, you look at it now and it's shockingly bad. But what happened was then they suddenly started kind of taking in other creators who had more kind of unique takes on comics. And now I think Image are one of the strongest publishers of essentially indie kind of books, because it's such a massive creative talent that you can find from Image, which is such a big jump from when they first started. So I think all those things kind of started coming together, and it just made a massive impact, certainly in the UK. And I suspect it had a similar kind of impact in other markets around the world that read the traditional American comic book.
And now let's talk about impact, because you mentioned 2007 was your first title that came out. You set a goal, you went out to achieve it. I am very much preaching goals right now for people during this COVID-19 pandemic. And so anybody who accomplishes a goal, I respect them for it. And you set a goal to publish Ragamuffins, to bring at that 2007 con. So what was this like, and this entire process like, of creating the book and writing the story and really being goal-oriented? And because it's interesting, and for those who don't know, it's dealing with time and keepers of time and dealing with universal time and breaking time and then fixing it back up.
Yeah. So. Well, I think it was one of the things, because it was an idea that I had, and I think it's one of those things because it's the first time although I'd written comics before, I'd never actually produced something completely myself. So that was a big learning curve in itself. So I actually then went out and actually got in touch with a guy I used to know from about 10, 15 years previously, who was an artist, a guy called Andy. So I worked with him on the Ragamuffins. He did the art and I did the story. And it was a fascinating experience, really. And it was one of those things that hindsight is a wonderful thing, because really in retrospect, what we actually produced, that very first comic, although it got me kind of involved and it got me kind of out there and started the ball rolling, it's a dreadful book. The best thing about it is the fact it's really nicely printed. The production values are terrific, but the book itself is awful. It's really, really bad. I mean, it's lettered in Comic Sans, for goodness sake. That's how much of a learning curve I was on. Now, I would never, ever do anything like that again. I learned so much from actually doing that book. The nice thing about it is when it actually came out, people were really kind of nice about it. And it kind of said a lot about the community, that it was such a kind of strong community and a welcoming community. So I learned a lot from doing that book. But the story itself was something which, I really like the idea of it. The idea is quite simple, of a group of people who repair time when time goes wrong. So that was the base of the core concept. So in the story itself, they're going backwards and forward through time, and there's time loops and there's paradoxes, and it's all done in a 20-page story, and it's just like overly compressed, and it really is what the actual idea itself I loved, but after a couple of years, I looked back at it, and it was a case of like, what have I done? What did I do then? What was I thinking? So what was kind of nice for me then, when we hit our 10-year point, to actually go back and actually redo it again. So I basically remastered the book. I did it with fresh art, and I redid the story a bit and re-released it. How I basically used all what I'd learned over that 10 years since to go back to that original concept and do it justice. So it went from a book which, after a couple of years, I was a little bit embarrassed about, to a book which I now am quite happy to kind of still kind of be proud of. So it was a nice little turnaround, really.
That is amazing, and I love the entire idea, especially because it does deal with time, and it's somewhat a little bit ironic to some degree that you got a chance to redo it and almost fix the wrongs that were in it. And the first book that was done in 2007 is probably one of the most important things you've published, not necessarily based on the story, but because it did get the ball rolling. And so, what is that like? That this is a significant book in your career, and you got to redo it the right way with 10 years of knowledge behind it again.
Yeah, yeah, and that was the nice thing about it. But the thing is, even though, after a couple of years, I could see all the flaws in it. It was what it kind of proved to me, and where it made a difference, because, and I hope it's the same in the States, but the comics community here in the UK, amongst the indie creators and those on the circuit, is really, really supportive. So when anyone comes in, they're really welcomed. So the other thing I remember about when I was at that first convention, and with copies of Ragamuffins, that first book, people were really kind of interested in what I was doing and how I'd done it. And I quickly felt part of that community. And that's one of the kind of the joys about creating comics for me. And it's something which, I've then seen myself in the years since, or in almost like a circular fashion, because obviously then over the years since then, I've been to shows, and then there's been people sometimes next to me, and it's the first time they've ever done a convention, and they're there with the first book they've ever produced. And it's been great to kind of connect with them and get to know them and ask them the same questions that people were asking me, and also support them in the same way that people were supporting me. And that's a really nice part of the whole kind of comic convention scene. Certainly, as an exhibitor, as a creator, I love that. And that's been one of the nice things over the years, is kind of meeting people who have never done a comic before, and then starting to do it, or even better, that when they've come to me at a show, they bought something from me, and then a year or two later they've decided to do their comic as well, and they're alongside me. That's a magical thing. I love that, and that's one of the real great joys of it all, really.
And even talking more about this, because we only spoke about one book so far, everybody, that you've worked on, and there's a few more that I want to get to before we get to the big two. And I want to talk about Dick Turpin, and you worked on two projects with that. And for those who don't know, Dick Turpin has a rich history in the UK, and you worked on The Crimson Plague, as well as the new one, which is The Vengeful Shade. So what was this like, working on Dick Turpin, given rich history and bringing that character somewhat back to some degree?
Yeah. Well, Dick Turpin, I owe a lot to Dick Turpin. I really do, because it's really kind of shaped how I've developed as a creator and how Time Bomb has developed as a company. Because once I'd done Ragamuffins back in 2007, and it was a one-shot, because for many years the only books I would release would be self-contained books, because that was an important part of the strategy behind Time Bomb. But for the second book, I wanted to do something completely different from what I'd done with Ragamuffins, which is a kind of science fiction contemporary story. So I ended up coming up with the idea of Dick Turpin, because that was seemed as far removed from ragamuffins as could possibly be. And the idea with the Dick Turpin story is that, you know, he's a highwayman, he robs coaches, but they're actually they're horror stories, historical horror stories featuring highwaymen. So the first Dick Turpin book that I did was called Dick Turpin and the Restless Dead, and that was in 2008, and that was riding the coattails, I'll be perfectly honest, of the whole explosion with zombies. So the idea was Dick Turpin goes to this ends up in this village in the middle of nowhere, and it's full of zombies, and he has to fight his way out. And that's basically the story. But as part of doing that story, I had to research the actual life of the real Dick Turpin, and that really had a huge impact on me, because I just, as part of the research, I just fell in love with the period, and I just fell in love with the idea of highwayman, and the whole kind of all the elements of that period really got me excited. So the Dick Turpin and the Crimson Plague one was then done a few years later, I think about 3 years after that first one, where and that's where he's up against vampires in 18th century London. And again, just a one shot, and, you know, done in one. But then the more recent one, that was this is effectively the third Dick Turpin book, Dick Turpin and the Vengeful Shade, and it's been in development a long time, because the original idea for Dick Turpin and the Vengeful Shade came back in 2011. So it's a project that's been worked on since 2011, in one way or another. I mean, certainly the first half of the script, I remember, was written back in 2012, 2013, and then when Rowe then came on as an artist, and he did about 20 odd pages. Then he had to put it to one side because he got work with DC and people like that. So it's been worked on for a long time. So it's great to finally be at a point where that third one is out. But now, because it's so long since those first two came out, essentially the Dick Turpin and the Vengeful Shade book relaunches the character for us. So although it's technically the third Dick Turpin story that I've done, in many ways it will be the first, because again, it's kind of different from those first few that I've done, and it sets up the character for the next 5 years. And the idea is, over the next few years, there'll be regular Dick Turpin stories released, one a year. And again, I'll be doing something similar as I've done with the Ragamuffins. I'll be going back to the previous ones, and getting them coloured so they can be released again. And with the Dick Turpin and the Restless Dead one, the zombie one, doing something very similar to Ragamuffins, getting it expanded and read them, because the original one was a 24-page story. I think it would work really well with something a bit longer, and a bit meatier, and in colour. And it's just using the character of Dick Turpin in these horror environments. And, you know, it's gothic horror. It's not kind of the horror you'd get in something like Saw or anything, you know, something like that. It's very much that kind of Hammer horror kind of tradition. So it's all long shadows and eerie spaces, and those traditional horror characters, those traditional horror tropes. So in many ways, they're kind of romps. So I describe them as a horror romp, rather than a straightforward horror story. But it plays on the idea of the two highwaymen who find themselves, through no fault of their own, apart from the fact that, you know, they're trying to rob someone in the first place. They end up in these situations where they're up against these traditional kind of horror characters, and how they get out of it. And again, it's kind of using the setting, the setting of the 18th century, just to tell really fun stories, and their characters are great to write. Dick Turpin is great to write, and in the stories that we use, he's always paired with another highwayman called Tom King, who was known as a gentleman thief, and both Turpin and Tom King are based on genuine historical characters who actually knew each other at the time and worked together at the time. But it's kind of my kind of take on those characters. And with Dick Turpin, the actual real character, the real Dick Turpin, he was a thoroughly unlikable individual. He had no redeeming features whatsoever. So so my kind of take on him is kind of, he's not quite as unpleasant as the real Dick Turpin was. However, he's still very much out for himself. He's still very much an anti-hero. And Tom King works as almost like a bit of a counterbalance to Dick Turpin. So it's almost like a buddy movie, but with Highwaymen. So they're good, fun stories to do. People seem to like the Dick Turpins that they have done, and I'm hoping that the Dick Turpin and the Vengeful Shade, when that comes out early next month, that will be well received as well. But they're great characters to do, and it's a great period.
And I want to shift to another section of Time Bomb where you are an editor, a publisher, and you helped to publish Chrono City. You also wrote and helped to edit and publish Brawlers. And there's been a few other, I guess, stories that you've helped to push out there, like Defiant, as well as the last ride of Henry Holden. So what is that like, not necessarily being the writer or the artist on the story, but managing the overall publishing aspect of it and handling that side? Because Time Bomb has had a weird history where for a good chunk of it in the beginning you wrote a lot of it and then you took a little bit of a break and now you're sort of back writing, and I'm assuming as we go forward it's going to be a mixture of both of those things.
Yeah, absolutely right. I mean, the idea with Time Bomb was always, not just to kind of showcase my own work, but also to feature work of other people that I wanted to kind of support and get out there. And it is, in a kind of where we are now going forward over the next few years. The output that we will be putting out and what we've got scheduled is probably 1/3 of it is something which I have a direct creative input in fact, it's something I've actually written, but the other stuff is stuff that other people have written, other people have kind of put together, and I'm have a editor hat or a publisher hat on for those things. So that's always been very much part of the ethos behind Time Bomb, and I think that's a sensible thing to do. I think, and I think certainly it's just great to get other people's work out there. It's great to be working with other writers, artists, colorists, letterers, the lot, just to do all that kind of stuff. I think it's really good to have a portfolio of published work which you're proud of, and one of the nice things about every single book that I've put out by other creators, I've been, I'm really proud of. I mean, it's great that I've been a part of that. And one of the nice things as well, of course, is then, when those creators either come back to me or other creators come and say, would you be interested in something through Time Bomb? And if it fits, I'm always happy to look at it. And I'm always happy to support it and get behind it. I think it's a real important thing to kind of not just do my own work, because I think the stuff I do anyway tends to be quite kind of, it's for the most part it's always kind of historical. It has that kind of flavor to it, and you don't want to just be doing the same kind of stuff over and over again. It's good to have other people involved, because then they come up with ideas which are far better than anything I could think of, and it's fun to work with them all. I mean, and I think as well these days with things like the internet and social media, it's so easy to connect with people, and that's been the nicest thing as well. So that's made things so much easier, because it's so easy now to kind of find new artists and writers. But more importantly, it's easy for them to find us if they're interested in coming to me with something which they think is suitable for Time Bomb that we'd like to get behind. So yeah, that's a real good part of it.
And now we're just going to jump right into it because it's right behind you on your banner, and it's Flintlock. And that's your baby in many ways. And so yes. Flintlock takes place in the 18th century. It's an anthology. It has a little bit of everything in it. So how did this idea come about? Because Flintlock is an insane book, and I read the first one and I love it. And I'll say it in the nicest way. It's a little bit odd and out there, but it works very well.
Well, thanks. I mean, I'm glad you liked it. We've touched on the origins of Flintlock already because it was, I said, it was doing the research for the Dick Turpin stuff, which just opened my fascination with the time period, the 18th century. So, I've become an 18th century obsessive. I love the period. I get so excited about the period. So Flintlock was really a combination of elements. It was something which I really enjoyed. A subject matter I really enjoyed and got excited about. But also, and again, you picked up on this earlier, was that I'd spent the first few books that Tarbon put out were stuff which was produced by me, and then I went to a period where the only stuff I was doing was produced by other people. It was written by other people, and so I was the publisher or the editor. And then I was at a convention. It was in 2015, and I met with someone, a guy by the name of Jasper Bark. He's a horror writer, and if you ever get a chance to read any of his novels, and that, please do, because he's a brilliant horror writer. And basically, he told me off in the nicest possible way because Jasper's such a nice chap. But basically, he took me to task. He said, "Why aren't you doing your own stuff anymore? Why are you only publishing other people's stuff?" And I tried to make some kind of lame excuse of time and commitments and that. But at the end of the day, I very quickly realized that Jasper was right. I shouldn't have kind of left my own stuff to one side. I should, I enjoy creating comics. I enjoy writing comics. So really, I had no excuse for not doing it. So it was kind of, that was the kind of, I guess, the kick at the backside that I needed to actually start writing something solidly myself again. And I wanted to do something which I really enjoyed because I figured, that would be the thing that would keep me interested anyway. So I knew it would be something historical, and it would be something in the 18th century. I didn't want to just rehash Dick Turpin again because I had the other Dick Turpins bubbling away in the background anyway. But I loved the historical adventure. I loved the period. Now, at the same time, I was at that show, and it was a big show in London, and there was another publisher there, a big American publisher. They're not as big as Marvel DC, but they're regularly widely known. And they had all these they had this massive stand, and they had all these kind of comics there, but all it was just cheesecake. It was just all this kind of, all these images of women with their kit off, with not wearing anything, and the stories, the actual interiors didn't seem to have anything to it. It was just these, half naked women, and I think the tipping point is where they had this little section, and they were selling, the variant covers. But the variants they had, they were slabbed, so they were in these plastic cases. And there was this one, and they were selling this variant for £20, which I guess would have been the equivalent of $25 then. And what it was the close-up of one of their female characters' naked backside. So it was just an ass, a close-up of an ass. And that's all it was. But it was so close up. All it really was these two kind of circles, which were kind of coloured pink in this kind of flesh tones. That's all it was. And people were guys were buying these at £20 a pop. And I thought, this is dreadful. And then I thought, well, actually, it'd be nice to kind of push back against all that nonsense and do something as well that features female characters, but in a way that, isn't kind of just tits and ass. It is just proper characters, proper characters, because proper female adventure characters. So the idea so that's how kind of Flintlock came about. So there's two elements. It was wanting to do something in the 18th century, which is a period I really got excited about. And it also wanted to do something that featured women, but as a pushback against that kind of, really weird way that female characters seem to be being presented in comics a lot of the time. Because I mean, I remember back in the UK, we used to have weekly comics, and that was a normal thing. I know they're quite unusual in America, but for years and decades, we had weekly comics through the 1960s and the 1970s. Pretty much any comic that was produced in the UK was produced as a weekly, and as part of that, you'd have the adventure comics for boys. Where things like 2000 AD started, and there's also titles like Battle and Action and stuff like that. But there was also then adventure comics for girls, and they always featured these kind of really kind of beautifully drawn, really great adventure stories, but featuring these strong female role models. So it was kind of a combination of those elements, trying to think, well, let's do something that features women, but isn't done in this kind of ridiculously just a sexualized way, have them as, so the women in Flintlock behave how women would have done at the time in the 18th century, were they doing those roles, how they're depicted in the book. So the idea with Flintlock is that in each of the stories, it's a female lead character. In those traditional roles which you'd normally expect to see a male character. So you have Lady Flintlock, who is the female highwayman. You have Shanty, who is the pirate queen. You have Peg Sparrowhawk, who is I guess a private detective at a time when private detectives didn't really exist. So there's all these kind of different characters and different kind of locations, but the idea is they all feature women, but in a really strong kind of positive, realistic way, and it's all in the 18th century. And the thing is, with the Flintlock books, each of the books feature at least 3 different stories, and each of the stories is all set in a different decade of the 18th century, but it's all set in the same timeline. So you could have a story set in 1726 having an impact on a story set in 1792, even though the characters involved in the story don't actually meet. And that was the idea behind Flintlock, and so it seems something I was quite excited about. And I'll be perfectly honest, when it was kind of, I'd written the first book and getting the first book ready, it was a bit kind of nervous about it, because I was wondering really if it was too niche. Although I was really interested in all these stories featuring strong women in the 18th century, would anybody else? But luckily, it very quickly found an audience and found a following, and Flintlock has become the flagship title of What Time Bomb Does. So it's been a great turnaround. It's really great to see, and it's been a real thrill ride with Flintlock. It really has.
And to even talk more about this, because a bunch of Flintlock has been funded through Kickstarter. And for those who are unfamiliar with Kickstarter, Kickstarter is an indie crowdfunding source way to do comic books. It's done on a lot of indie level. And it's a really cool way. And I believe Flintlock was funded extremely fast, several of these books. So what does that mean for you, that people are willing and want this content, and they're willing to throw money before it's done because they believe in the project?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing is, we certainly with myself and Kickstarter, it took me a long time to come around to the idea of Kickstarter. For many years, I was very anti-Kickstarter. I really was. And in fact, there was a con back in 2012, 2013, where I was on a panel, and it was like a panel debate, and it was the people for Kickstarter and the people against Kickstarter, and I was on the against Kickstarter. So I really did not like the platform at all. But then I realised, and it was I started to notice. What actually changed my mind was seeing how tabletop games were being done through Kickstarter. And then I kind of had a bit of an epiphany, really, and I realised that my problem with Kickstarter wasn't the platform itself; it was actually what I'd actually seen it used for and how it had been used. So my idea with using Kickstarter right from the start was not to approach it as an all or nothing funding campaign. So please give me none of that. Please give me your money or the book will be done. None of that kind of stuff. Because I was at a point where I knew the books were going to be produced. But I was really excited about using Kickstarter as using it as a distribution option and using it as a pre-order platform. Which what I could see was happening with the tabletop games a lot of the time, which are, you know, the really successful ones. So it was really using that approach for Kickstarter rather than the all or nothing approach. So the idea with the Kickstarters was to try and build that international following, and try and find a distribution model which was not Diamond. I mean, I'd used Diamond in the past. I'd had a few books done through Diamond, but ultimately, you know, the amount of effort, you know, to get the books solicited through Diamond, and then it wasn't really. I mean, it wasn't really amazing. So Kickstarter seemed a really exciting opportunity to do something a bit different, and also with Kickstarter, of course, you can directly reach your audience. And that seemed quite an exciting thing to do as well. So my approach to the Kickstarters, and since the first Bomb Scares book in 2015, pretty much every single release through Time Bomb has had that pre-order campaign, and it's stressing out they are pre-order campaigns. And the idea with the Kickstarter is that the targets for that we're looking for are low. They're much lower than the actual cost to produce the book. And the reason is it means that anyone who pre-orders the book through Kickstarter gets the book at the most attractive price possible. So once the book is on sale, it'll be more expensive than it was on the Kickstarter, because there were a few things that I'd seen from other people doing Kickstarter that I really didn't like, and I just wanted to avoid. I've seen, when people ask for $10,000 for a 24-page color comic book. Nonsense. There's no way a 24-page color comic will cost $10,000. Why are you asking for it? Also, what I was always getting a bit annoyed about was when you would see someone offering a book on Kickstarter for $10 an issue, and then when you see them just after the book's released 2 months later, they're at a convention and they're selling that book for $5 an issue. And again, I kind of had a huge kind of problem with that, and I still do, because to me, Kickstarter, you should properly reward your backers, because essentially they're putting faith down in your product before it's almost sight unseen. They're putting down their money in good faith. So to me, it makes more sense to give any backer the best deal available on that book, because they're good enough to support it right from the start before it's even been printed. So that's my approach to Kickstarter. And it seems to work, because I've done 12 campaigns. Every single one of them has successfully funded. Every single one of them has either been successfully delivered or it is in the process of being successfully delivered. And it's a really key thing. And what's been interesting for me is thinking back on my original ideas about building that international audience. And my very first Kickstarter, it turned out it had about a 12% international take up. And my most recent one had a 50% international take up. So 50% of the support came from outside the UK. And that's a huge shift. And what's been really great to see is have returning backers. So people who, so I have people who supported the very first one and have pretty much supported everyone since. And that's great. So you're building that audience, and I can connect with them directly. So that's how I kind of do it. So I think it's a brilliant platform if you use it properly.
Yeah, no, I like Kickstarter, and I have my own problems with Kickstarter because I've participated in very successfully, thoroughly run Kickstarters, and I also got a disastrous book do to somebody, and I still haven't achieved everything that was promised to me in that Kickstarter. And I know the reason why. And it was a very expensive Kickstarter, and I know the book is selling for half of what I paid for it, or what I pledged. So I actually agree with everything that you just said, because that's how it should be run, and I feel that most Kickstarters are actually running the exact opposite way. And
Yeah.
I don't think it's very conducive to the fans, and especially when I'm going and taking a bet on a project for somebody.
Yeah.
And
I agree, and I think one of the most frustrating things about it sometimes, and you tend to see this more from like the maybe the pro artists or semi-pro creators who try to do a Kickstarter, where the book is delayed because then they've suddenly been offered a gig elsewhere, so they put their Kickstarter to one side, and I think that's an appalling thing to do, because essentially, once you do a Kickstarter and people back it and you succeed, you've entered into a contract with those people to produce that book. So that's what you should be doing. You've effectively been paid to do the book, sit down and get the book done. Because at the end of the day, if you try, the idea that you would then, you've generated several $1,000s from a Kickstarter, and then DC offer you a gig and you go and do that for 6 months or 2 years instead. I think that's shocking. That's shocking behaviour, because you wouldn't do it the other way around. Yeah. So why do it? Why treat your backers like that? That's a terrible thing to do. So I think you can get burnt with a Kickstarter, but I think at the same time, if you do pull stunts like that, if you do kind of let people down, people will remember, and I think the people that do Kickstarters well, and the people that kind of deliver what they're supposed to deliver, or at least give you some sensible communication why something is running late, because things do run late. I think at the moment, look at the situation we're in now globally. I think it's completely understandable now that some things may run a little bit late because of what's going on at the moment. But let people know, communicate, but don't don't disrespect the people that gave you their hard-earned money in the first place, really.
well, I'll tell you the brief story because it's very interesting. And as a publisher, you're going to sort of cringe on this, is that this person who was doing it wasn't even a writer. They were an editor, and they were forming their own publisher at the same time this book was coming out, and they were getting into Diamond. And so what they did is that the book actually was delayed by about 20 months, no communication, none of the rewards were met. I interviewed the person whose book it was that they were republishing, this publisher, and they weren't thrilled about it. And apparently, all these people who this person raised about $16,000 and kept no communication. And in many ways, for me, it took me about a year to even back another Kickstarter project. And there was projects I wanted to back, and I have friends who were running them. And I said, look, I can't do it. And then when I was explaining the story, they're like, I wouldn't want you to back. And so I actually commend you, because you seem to run it like a professional publisher would run it. There are companies that know how to do this. One of the companies that runs amazing Kickstarters is Zenscope. Whenever they do a Kickstarter to republish a book, they do those very, very successfully, very thoroughly. And I know there's other professional artists who do it as well, but there's a lot of people who do horrific Kickstarters.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious what your thoughts are on that, because in many ways, when somebody screws up on Kickstarter, it hurts everybody.
It does, yes. I think it does. And I think where it can really hurt is if it's your first experience using Kickstarter, because if it's your first experience and you have a bad experience, you'll never touch it again. But that's the same for anything, If you go to if you go to a restaurant and it's terrible for the first time and it's an appalling experience you have, you would never ever go to that restaurant again. It's a similar kind of thing, and I think that's the thing. It's kind of, I think you should always approach, no matter what you do, no matter what level you are, you should always approach what you do with a level of professionalism. Now, professionalism doesn't necessarily mean huge earnings and that you're making lots of money. It's actually the willingness and the mindset to do something well, or to do something to the best of your ability, and be and be communicative about that. Be magnanimous in defeat also, I think. So I think it's frustrating when you see other people just not doing it well or not doing it properly, because it affects everybody. At the same time, you kind of hope that if you've done something well a few times, then people, you've built up that element of trust anyway. So, from my perspective, I hope that even if someone has backed somebody else's project and for whatever reason they were let down, I hope that if there's people that have backed any of my projects and they've been happy with what they've received, they would consider backing a future project if it was of interest to them. And I think that's really the best you can do. But it's about being professionalism, or being a professional all the time. And I think in comics that applies to whatever level, whatever you're trying to do in comics, from doing if you're going to submit to an editor, to how you speak to people at conventions, how you interact with people through social media. I think part of being a credible creator and a credible part of the comics community, no matter where you are in the world, is having that kind of professional reputation. I think that's really important.
And to continue speaking about this professional stance that you have, I do want to talk about, I think it was your last Kickstarter, and that was with Bomb Scares, which is a very interesting horror anthology. Did you do a Kickstarter for both of them or just one of them?
No, yeah. I mean, the first Bomb Scares in 2015, that was the first time I'd used Kickstarter. So the first Bomb Scares was done and the second one was done through Kickstarter last year. And the third one, the third Bomb Scares book, when that's ready, that'll be done through Kickstarter as well. That'll be pre-ordered through Kickstarter as well.
So what I like about Bomb Scares, and I'm not a big horror guy, and I took a look at it, and it's a little much for me because I'm not a big horror guy, but it does have that Jack Davis Tales from the Creep sort of vibe to it. It's got that old school horror that I feel is sort of dead in America to some degree, which I liked about that book, as well as it does have those little tidbits of humor, and a lot of people worked on this. I think it was over 30 people worked on these books, which is mind-blowing. And it's quite impressive. So what was that like, putting these together and having so many people coming in?
One of the things with Bomb Scares is it's great you picked up on the Tales from the Crypt kind of atmosphere, because again, and it's a black and white book, and probably about half of the stuff we put out is black and white, because black and white has a real strong tradition in the UK. I know in the US it's the colour is king, but black and white is still really important, and I think certainly for things like horror, it's really, really effective. A really great example is things like, when I was growing up and they used to kind of reprint the things like the Marvel comics in Britain, they were always reprinted in black and white. And some stuff like Gene Colan's Tomb of Dracula is stunning in black and white. If ever you can kind of track down the big chunky essential volumes that Marvel did, the big black and white reprints of Tomb of Dracula, just get it, because it is much better than the actual color comics, because it just drips atmosphere, that black and white artwork. So that was a key thing with Bomb Scares. But the thing is with Bomb Scares as well, and you picked up on the amount of creators involved, because each of the Bomb Scares books has between 16 and 18 complete stories in there. So that's a lot of creators.
A lot.
And yeah, so they're big, chunky, 96-page books. They're decent packages. But one of the key things with the Bomb Scares books was, that's where, because over the years I've met lots of other creative people, and I'm at the point where if I'm lucky enough to work with them, I can. So a key part of Bomb Scares and how it comes together, and its success, and the tone of the stories and how it feels, is down to the editor, Paul H. Birch. Now, Paul is someone I've known for a number of years, but I only met him through doing Time Bomb. There's lots of people I know who are really good friends, but I've only met since doing Time Bomb, which is another great thing about doing what I do. You meet some fabulous people. But Paul is an old school editor. He's edited newsstand magazines back in the day. He's edited comics. He's done a lot of kind of stuff. So Bomb Scares is something which he kind of does for me, because I love the idea of the Bomb Scares, of horror anthologies. I love that kind of tradition, but I knew that there was no way I would be able to kind of pull together the amount of creators that you would need, because when you do an anthology, with all the creators, it's like herding cats. It really is. It can be a joy, but it can also be an absolute nightmare. So it's very much Paul. I said Paul does those books. He does the Bomb Scares books. So what he does, he keeps me up to date on progress. So he shares with me the strips that he's accepted, and his strategy for the book. But I want to stress that Bomb Scares, the success of Bomb Scares, is down to Paul, because with an anthology, what's really important is that you have a really strong editor that's in charge of that anthology. Because I think an anthology is not just a collection of different stories put together. It's a lot more. A successful anthology is a lot more than that. So he approaches Bomb Scares with a meticulous professionalism. He really does. And so the end result is it really is the best package it can be. So Bomb Scares, it's definitely going to be a staple of our future release schedules. I said we've got the third chunky volume coming out, maybe the end of this year, but with all this going on, it's probably going to be pushed back to next year. But even beyond that, there are plans for the Bomb Scares brand, as it were, within Time Bomb.
And you just mentioned, and we mentioned it multiple times throughout this entire discussion, that COVID-19 is going on and that it definitely is affecting the comic world. And for those who don't know, San Diego Comic-Con is not happening. Various Comic-Cons have been canceled all across America. I don't know what the UK scene looks like. I have friends in different areas. Sam Johnson did an interview with me, and then Burchill, who's now known as Chris, is a wrestler, is in the UK, and a bunch of his stuff got canceled. So I'm very curious how you foresee the comic business being affected for Time Bomb in particular, as well as the grand total, and then even going beyond that, the convention scene.
Well, I think the first thing is the most immediate effect is the conventions. I think certainly for us over here. The perfect example is that by this time of the year, as we're coming to the end of April, I'd have expected to kind of have done about 8 shows, and actually done one, which was back in right at the 1st of February, just before everything just kind of fell apart. So and the way it's going at the moment, a lot of the shows that we were expecting to do April and May, they've been postponed until they've given dates of June and July and August. But as it's going on, I am starting to think now that's still really optimistic as well. So at the moment, where my headspace is with the whole thing, that I'm not expecting there to be any shows taking place, certainly in the UK, until the end of until next year, perhaps, or maybe right at the tail end of this year. Simply because one of the things that's coming out through the news updates and the government briefings that we're getting every day here, is that the entertainment aspects of things that have been closed down will be amongst the last things to be lifted when they start to move opening things up. So pubs, clubs, those kind of things, but also mass gatherings. Let's be perfectly honest about it. At a convention in the UK, the bigger ones, you can get 150,000 people there over the course of 2 days. So they would need to be completely confident that that wouldn't cause a huge kind of health problem for things like that. And also at the moment, all the major venues that they have, some of these big events in the UK, are currently have been converted into emergency hospitals. So they're being used at the moment. Those venues are being used to kind of treat people who are very ill from the virus. So at the very least, until those hospitals are no longer being used in those locations, there won't be shows of any kind taking place in those locations, let alone comic shows. So that's where my personal headspace is in terms of what the rest of this year will look like. Now, on the flip side of that, what it's meant is that just because the conventions have stopped, production in terms of the creative side of it, the art, the writing, lettering, all that kind of stuff, that is still continuing. Okay, I mean, in the last few days, I've had the latest sample pages through from various artists for me to sign off and approve and move on to the next stage. So in terms of that, the production is continuing. The question mark at the moment for me is the actual release schedules, because the main outlet I sell through in the UK is there's three. There's the my online store at timebombcomics.com. There is the any of the pre-order sales I get from the Kickstarter campaigns, and then there is the shows. And on average, I tend to do around about 25 shows a year. Okay, or Time Bomb does. I'm not all of them, but Time Bomb will be. So half the year. Half of the weekends a year, Time Bomb usually has a presence somewhere in the UK, and that's our kind of one of our main distribution outlets. So at the moment, it's kind of still producing stuff, because the expectation is at some point things will start to open up again, and I want to be ready with books which are good to go, and so we can kind of just. There'll be no delay once it does open up again. Now, one of the things as well that we also did this year, and again, this was put into place just before all this started. It turned out to be quite fortuitous. Is that we hired someone new to come in work with me in Time Bomb, and the position is a lady called Katie. And we've hired her, and we've called her our digital overlord, because one of the things that I felt that Time Bomb really needed to kind of do better on was the whole kind of social media interaction, digital kind of a distribution, all that kind of stuff. So although the cons have stopped, what we're trying to do is then build a bigger presence regarding our digital awareness, our digital presence. So our books are on Comixology, things like the Twitter is being kind of looked after properly, those kind of things. So we're trying to kind of look at what digital opportunities there are as well. Now, what we're doing as well, whenever there's a weekend where we would have been at one of the major shows, what we're doing through our website is doing like a flash sale on the books. So for the weekend of the show that would have taken place, people then can order the books from the website, and it would work out the same price as if they would have got it over the table. So we kind of adjust the postage down and stuff. So if you would normally buy a book from us at a table for £7, you can get it through the website at £7. You don't have to pay any extra postage. So we're trying to do little stuff like that. And really, that's all I think you can do at the minute. You can't really do much more than that. There's no plans. I'm not planning to do any Kickstarters until the existing books are done and out, which is the Dick Turpin one, because I think that's fair. I want to get the product into people's hands before I start something up again. But the idea is that once things do start up again, we will have all these kind of books that are in advanced stages of production, or even fully finished, that we can just go straight off the blocks with. It's a really strange situation to be in. But I think the key thing is it's about people being safe, and people being safe is more important than comics, you know. I think that's the thing. It's people's safety and people not dying is more important than comics. So that's where I am with this whole thing. And I know it's really difficult for people, and I know it's challenging. And you see things like San Diego being cancelled, and comic shops closing, that kind of stuff. But really, at the end of the day, if it means that someone who would have gone to San Diego this year is alive to go there next year, that's what it's all about. I think that's that's where I stand with the whole thing.
And now I think that's a great place to end, but I do want to give you an opportunity. Where can people buy your books so they can support Time Bomb?
Well, I mean, the best place is the website. So timebombcomics.com. So it's the online store. You can get all the books there, all the prices that are listed there. You put in the country where you are, so shipping's included, and just that's the best place to get our books, and just keep an eye on the site, because I said we have these flash sales at the same time. On social media, the Time Bomb Comics page on Facebook is worth following, and because we put lots of stuff up there, you get art samples and previews and that kind of stuff. At Time Bomb Comics is our Twitter feed, so by all means get in touch with us that way. And I said, search me out on Facebook directly, by all means. So if you see me on Facebook, by all means send me a friend request and connect with me that way, because it's always good to kind of connect with people who love comics as much as I do.
Well, I would like to thank you for being on, because this has been amazing for me as a conversation. Really enjoyed Flintlock, as well as what I am doing, just so everybody knows who's watched this all the way through, is that this all started because people like wrestlers, people like cosplayers, people like comic writers and artists and voice actors who would like to be on, typically right now, are being hurt in the industries that they're in. And I figured that it's time to give everybody an opportunity to promote themselves and talk about what they're working on. And so I really do encourage everybody, if you have a few extra dollars, go pick up a comic from Time Bomb Comics. If you don't, that's okay, because times are tough, but there's no excuse for not supporting anybody anymore through social media. You have Time Bomb Comics' Facebook page, you have their Twitter, and liking that stuff is free, and you never know what you might discover on either of those pages or those feeds. And if you're into comics and you're into some indie stuff, because you're getting sick of DC and Marvel, the indie scene is very much popping. And I can't recommend Flintlock, at least the first one, enough, because I thoroughly enjoyed it. So thank you for being on.
Cheers.